A new book by famed journalist Bob Woodward has Washington buzzing. According to Woodward, former President Trump has maintained contact with Russian President Vladimir Putin since leaving office. In the book, Woodward says Trump has spoken to Putin on the phone up to 7 times over the last few years, and also sent COVID test kits to Putin while still in office at the height of the pandemic. White House columnist Niall Stanage joins us to discuss this and much more. Niall, for this scoop on the Putin contacts, Woodward relies on a single source, an aide to Trump. Now, Trump is blasting Woodward, kind of making fun of him, attacking him personally, while not actually denying that report about the Putin contacts. J.D. Vance, in a speech, said basically, so what if he did? What do you make of this report?
I think it is damaging to former President Trump to a degree, because we know there's this existing narrative about closeness to Putin. Now, Trump would say Russia hoax and all of that, and this is, of course, very separate from the allegations or suggestions that were investigated all those years back by Robert Mueller. But any suggestion that Trump is sort of overly friendly with Putin, I think does have the capacity to be damaging, and obviously this is coming as we're within the last month of the presidential campaign.
And especially as Harris is trying to appeal to these like Liz Cheney Republicans. I wonder if these type of stories has an impact on them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, obviously there is a suggestion within the broad framework of closeness to Putin that Trump is sort of weaker, or at least less hawkish on national security than Republicans have traditionally been. We see that in his view of Ukraine. Now, his supporters would argue he's less of a warmonger, despite his often intemperate way of speaking, but the Putin issue isn't a good one for him.
On this issue of sending test kits to Putin, Harris was on Howard Stern's show. I believe she taped it yesterday. She said, look, the country was in a crisis at that moment. Trump is sending valuable supplies to an authoritarian adversary of the United States. Harris has been, I think, a little bit reluctant to talk about kind of COVID in general and Trump's response during that time period. But maybe this gives her a little window into reminding people that there was some chaos in the administration at that time.
Yeah, I think it could. And I think the importance for Harris, or maybe the utility for Harris, is that it goes to her bigger argument about selfishness on the part of Trump. We hear her make that argument a lot about the economy, and she links it to what she sees as his narcissism, the idea that he's too busy talking about himself or relitigating his grievances to help people out. If you can augment that argument by saying, look, during COVID he apparently or allegedly sent these kits to Vladimir Putin, you can keep that within the same framework.
As Kamala Harris makes rounds of appearances in a week-long media blitz, comments in each of those appearances are being picked apart. Let's take a listen.
A Harris administration, what would the major changes be, and what would stay the same?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm obviously not Joe Biden.
I noticed.
And so that would be one change in terms of...
Well, we're obviously two different people, and we have a lot of shared life experiences. For example, the way we feel about our family and our parents and so on. But we're also different people, and I will bring those sensibilities to how I lead.
You see there a little bit of a lack of an ability to substantively differentiate herself from President Biden, who is an unpopular president at this moment in time. You have a story out now assessing Harris's effectiveness in this media blitz. How do you grade her performance?
I think it has been uneven. I think she has had good moments, particularly in the softer interviews, but I think she did not particularly impress me on 60 Minutes, which was where she faced the harshest questioning. I thought that her explanations for her previous shifts in position during that interview were not all that impressive, really. Now, on the issue of Biden, she does have a difficult task in a way. She's the incumbent vice president running when the president is unpopular, as you said. So that is a tricky one to articulate. She has opted for this idea of, well, I'm not Joe Biden and I'm also not Donald Trump. Okay, that's fine. That might be enough to win an election. Maybe it's not the most inspiring or certainly detailed platform on which to run.
On the flip-flopping issue, I don't see why she doesn't just come out and say, hey, look, I was vice president for 4 years. You learned some things. I've developed new opinions of things like Medicare for all and fracking. It seems like she dances around it in a way. She's trying to say that she keeps her values, but not really just kind of leveling with the American people, like I think there might be a window for her to do.
Yeah, and I think that has been a problem for her at other times in her political career. There have been questions quite often about authenticity when it comes to Kamala Harris. Sometimes those questions have been asked by the left. That's why her 2020 primary campaign didn't really go anywhere. But in relation to these changes of opinion, like being in favour of a ban on fracking and now she's not, she could just say, I've changed my mind. And in some ways that would be a more direct way of explaining those shifts than doing what she did in 60 Minutes, for example, which was this rather nebulous answer about travelling around the country and believing that people wanted the spirit of compromise. I'm not sure that gets her over the authenticity hurdle.
Is Harris being held to an unfair standard here? It's not like Trump is going out giving eloquent speeches about his policy proposals. Often on the trail he says things that are outlandish, maybe is the diplomatic word to use. Is it unfair the way we're dissecting everything that she says and kind of giving maybe Trump a pass?
I think it's a great question, and I do think with Trump he is often given a pass, or it is just assumed that he will say these outlandish things that would get a lot of criticism if Harris said them, or if Biden said them, or if any more orthodox politician said them. Sometimes I think we in the media get too tangled up in the idea of will it affect his polls, and very little affects Donald Trump's polls because his base is so solidly behind him. I do think there could be more scrutiny on some of the more outlandish things he says, on the lack of detail he still provides, for example, on really central issues in American life, like, for example, healthcare. He still wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act. What does he want to put in its place? We still have very little detail about it.
And on the flip-flopping, we dissect every flip-flop that Harris has made, but of course Trump has changed his positions on some key issues as well. Democrats are anxious. Also, the sky's blue and water is wet. But a month ago, it seemed like Harris had momentum in this race. Now, it seems like all the battleground polls are deadlocked. The race, according to the prognosticators, is essentially a toss-up. Is this normal hand-wringing from Democrats, or do the Democrats actually have a problem here, a fundamental problem?
It's partly just normal hand-wringing. I mean, Democrats always fret that doom is at hand and they're about to lose horribly. Having said all that, there are reasons to worry about that. I'm not sure if I would describe it as a fundamental problem, but the thing that frightens Democrats who I speak to is this idea that Donald Trump has tended to outperform his poll ratings both times he has run before, 2016 and 2020. Now, given that, as you rightly said, the polls are deadlocked right now, if Trump does better than the polls, he's going to be the next president. It's just as simple as that. Maybe the polls will be right this year and they give Harris a very fractional advantage, or maybe she outperforms because we know the issue of abortion and reproductive rights is much more salient this year. We don't obviously know the answer to all this until election night, but that's one of the main reasons why Democrats are concerned.
Let's talk about Pennsylvania, quite possibly the most important battleground state. Former President Trump has 2 rallies in Pennsylvania today. He's going to be in Scranton this afternoon. Later on tonight in Reading, Harris has 400 staff members in the state, according to the New York Times. I saw something else that was interesting. Trump, Harris, and their allies are going to spend $350 million this year in Pennsylvania alone on TV ads alone. As you said earlier, we need some stock in those TV stations. What do you think is going to be the deciding factor in Pennsylvania in this race?
At risk of being cliched, it might well end up being turnout. I mean, Pennsylvania is a state where the Democratic strategist James Carville famously said it's Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Alabama in between, right? And what he was alluding to was that Democrats need big votes out of the cities, not only from black voters, but also from young, affluent liberals. And that vote has to be large enough to offset a Republican advantage in the middle of the state and in more rural and ex-urban areas. Obviously, in a race so tightly balanced, simply getting your voters to the polls is going to be a huge issue. It's not really people, I think, deciding between Harris and Trump. It's people deciding between voting and not voting. And that's why we see that vast sum of money being spent trying to really motivate people to get out there and cast those ballots.
Democratic vice presidential candidate Tim Walz says the U.S. should end the Electoral college system and replace it instead with a popular vote to choose the president. He made these comments during fundraising events out on the West Coast. This is probably not a uncommon thinking on, especially among Democrats who are at a disadvantage when it comes to presidential races due to the Electoral college. But I was thinking maybe you don't say that right now when you're trying to lose or trying to win the Electoral College. What did you make of the comments?
So I thought that well, first of all, I think the debate is genuinely interesting as to whether you should have the Electoral College or just a straight national popular vote. But I did think it was weird that Walz went off message just at a random fundraiser and started talking about this. Then the Harris campaign had to come out and say, well, that's not really officially our position. It's a strange thing to just make unguarded opinions or comments about. And I think it does add to the growing list of worries that Walz is not quite living up to his billing. I mean, I do think he has a lot of Midwestern everyman charm. The Coach Walz thing, I do think, is effective. But there have now been a couple of times where he's had to explain what he calls past misspeaking, when he has said things that were not in fact true. And this is sort of an unforced, I don't know if it's an error, but it's an unforced controversy for sure.
Not on message. Let's talk a little bit about foreign policy. President Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke today over the phone. This is the first time that they've spoke in weeks. It comes as Israel expands its ground incursion into Lebanon, and ceasefire talks in Gaza failed to produce any results. Also, in that Bob Woodward book we were talking about earlier, there are these explanations of expletive-laced tirades that Biden has gone on over his frustration with Netanyahu over the handling of the war in Gaza. What do you make of the relationship between these two leaders?
So I think that we hear all the time that President Biden is frustrated with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The thing that would be the criticism, certainly from the left, is Biden never actually does anything about it. I mean, he has paused one arms shipment and supplied billions of dollars in arms for Israel. There's obviously tension. I think there is genuine frustration in the White House about the way Netanyahu conducts his business. But is it electorally harmful to Biden? Or to Harris by extension? Maybe to the extent that it frustrates progressives. We talk a lot about the state of Michigan, which has the highest concentration of Arab American voters in the nation. It could be salient there, but does the fact that Biden is annoyed or not with Netanyahu really play into that? I'm not sure.
All right. Great insight as always. Niall Stanage, White House columnist. Appreciate you for coming on.
Thank you.
During the 2024 election cycle, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have focused heavily on the economy. And with a national debt topping $28 trillion, voters are focused on how each side of the aisle plans to tackle that issue. Washington correspondent Jesse Tenur has the latest on a new report from the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which laid out a new analysis of both parties' economic plans and how much it will impact the national debt.
For my plan.
Under my plan.
Regardless of the plan, a new report from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget says the economic proposals from both presidential candidates would significantly increase the national debt.
These could arguably be excellent things to do. The point is, we need to pay for them.
Maya McGinnis, the nonpartisan group's president, says former President Donald Trump's plan would be worse for the nation's debt, adding about $7.5 trillion over 10 years compared to $3.5 trillion from Vice President Kamala Harris.
Both of these would lead us in a significant wrong direction at a time when our fiscal situation is so off kilter.
Both candidates plan to act on the 2017 Trump tax cuts that expire next year. But while Trump promised to make all of the tax cuts permanent,
They call the tax queen because she loves taxes.
What I am proposing.
Harris vowed to only keep the cuts that help those making less than $400,000 a year. The report says the other most expensive parts of Trump's economic plan end taxes on overtime pay and Social Security benefits, while expanding the child tax credit is the second most expensive for Vice President Harris.
Here's how we pay for it.
To pay off debt.
Trump would make the government money with heavy tariffs on foreign imports, while Vice President Harris would impose more taxes on large corporations and the wealthiest Americans.
Both of those would raise revenue, but again, not enough to entirely offset the campaign's proposals.
McGinnis says the biggest thing missing from their ideas is a plan to specifically reduce the nation's debt. In Washington, I'm Jesse Tenor.
And that's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.